There are many people involved in the discourse of the Israeli Palestinian conflict who have very little information on the history of both the Zionist and the National Palestinian movements, and they claim several idiotic things because they never opened a history book on the subject. The main purpose of this channel is to make people more knowledgeable and less a zombie horde educated by TikTok. In this specific series of videos, I portray the narrative of the birth of the Zionist movement, its goals, its ideologies, and the historical events that led to its creation and development. This first video is about the birth of the first proto-Zionist movement, Hibat Tzion, which functioned from 1881 to 1918. My main source of information in this specific video is of Professor Yossi Goldstein's We Were the First, The History of Hibat Tzion, 1881 to 1918. Goldstein's main research career was on the topics of early Zionism and the history of the State of Israel. He is doing this type of research since the 1970s, and he is currently a professor in the University of Ariel in Israel. The main sources of his research in We Were the First are secondary sources, but he mostly uses them for their included primary sources, which consist of hundreds of diary entries by the people involved in Hibat Tzion, newspaper articles by Jews who lived in Eastern Europe at the time, manifestos of leading leaders within Hibat Tzion and their affiliated milieu, and Congress protocols. Therefore, while not perfect, this book assimilates previous research done on Hibat Tzion and gives a thorough narrative of its existence and function. The first video on Hibat Tzion is based on the first chapter of his book, which deals with the years 1881 to 1884. So let's start. In 1880, there were 7.6 million Jews in the world. 6.7 million of them in Europe and 630,000 of them in the Middle East. There were only 4 million Jews in Europe in 1850, which shows a clear demographic incline in only 30 years. At the time Jews in Europe got emancipation in Western Europe, Jews could finally become full citizens in European states. They could live where they want, participate in the political game, work at any type of job the law allows, and they could learn in non-Jewish schools and universities. Many Jews saw this change as the end of the Jewish exile, where Jews could live full lives without living in constant fear of persecution or capricious kings and governments that completely expelled Jews from certain states in the past, or just decided to pass laws that discriminated Jews specifically. Nevertheless, these hopes became bitterly contested as the 19th century came to its end. Many groups saw the Jews as foreigners and believed they could never assimilate, or that they are traitors and conspirators who would never be loyal to the state and would only further universal Jewish agendas. Some of these groups even inaugurated political parties. The rise of ethnic nationality in Europe since the mid-19th century also heightened the tensions between emancipated Jews and nationalists. A Jewish boy could learn at school about the Gauls as the founding ancestors of France, while going to a public school and feel ostracized. But all of these paled in comparison to what happened in Eastern Europe. Tsarist Russia, which controlled most of the spaces in which European Jews lived since 1770, wanted to assimilate the Jews without giving them complete emancipation. Jews were banned to serve in key roles in the army and government. They were banned to live in big major cities, like Moscow. They could not work at jobs the other population could, and they were levied special taxes and had laws that discriminated them, especially like the number of Jews that could learn in the university made Jews less intellectual. Also, they were obliged to serve 20 years in the Russian army. Mandatory. The Tsarist Russian government also adopted ethnic nationality that highlighted the Pravoslavic Christianity, which was very anti-Semitic and viewed the Jews in even more derogatory terms than the Catholic and Protestant form of Christianity. Nevertheless, many Jews in Russia since the mid-19th century adopted European standards of enlightenment by enlightened thought and enlightened politics, while being more traditionally religious than their Western European brothers. They started to learn secular studies, had new newspapers that adopted a modern take on Jewish lives, and preached for Jews becoming more open to the non-Jewish world. While immigration, due to poverty and crowding, was a thing in the years before 1880, this problem became much more acute in the 1880s. The main reason for the worsening was the murder of the Tsar, Alexander II, by Narodnik dissidents who believed in extreme socialism through violence and in an agrarian state, a bit like Maoism. Some very few of the revolutionaries were of Jewish origin. This resulted in a wide series of massacres in Jewish communities that started in the 27th of April, 1881. Starting in Russia and seeping to Ukraine and Romania, these pogroms or attacks saw the violent massacre of dozens of Jews and the destruction of 200 Jewish communities. Well, this wasn't new to Eastern European Jews. There was a much more deadly purge of Jews in Ukraine in 1648 to 1649, in which 50,000 Jews were slaughtered as part of Khmelnytsky Ukrainian war against Russia's control. This was the first time since the emancipation and Western Moorists entered Russia that such a pogrom happened. This made Jews disillusioned with the possibility of true equality. The government, for its part, only encouraged this view as it blamed the Jews for not assimilating fast enough, which caused the natural response of the angry peasant population of Ukraine and Russia. The government even encouraged Jews to immigrate with the proclamation of Nikolai Ignatayev, the foreign minister and the main persecutor of the army General Sterlinkov. As the pogrom didn't stop in May, an extremely violent one in Odessa happened on the 3rd of May, there was a large movement of disillusioned Jews who decided to leave Tsarist Russia. Self-help Jews organization like the Jewish-French Alliance, inaugurated in 1860, donated money and created with local immigrant groups a committee that tried to help Jews immigrate to the United States. Now, Alliance was part of a new form of Jewish self-help international groups that believed that only through adopting the mores and lifestyle of the Enlightenment and by making the Jews more assimilated in their culture and jobs to the middle class of Europe, do the Jews can find peace. They had a big network of schools in which Jews in North Africa, the Middle East, and the Balkans were taught math, French, geography, philosophy, and economics, together with industrial jobs and agriculture. Meanwhile, Jews in Odessa, Brody, and Kiev contacted Alliance, and together they tried to move thousands of Jews who wanted to leave Russia to New York. Some Jews were against this, as they still believe in the assimilation of Jews in Russia. But as the months went on, the pogroms consisted, and the government only blamed the Jews for the massacres, while also refusing to use substantial military or police force to stop them. Since May 1881, there are some very minor voices in the Eastern European Jewish community and newspapers that saw a different solution. These solutions were portrayed in newspapers like The Herald, Hamagid, or Dawn, Hashachar, newspapers that were relatively widespread among the more assimilated Jews of Eastern Europe, but ones that still adopted Jewish conservatism to some extent. Mordechai Ben Hillel, a young Jewish author, published an article in which he calls to immigrate to Israel immediately. The editor of The Dawn, Peretz Smolenskin, also explained in his newspaper at this time why Israel is better than the United States as an immigration destination for the suffering Jews in Eastern Europe. These articles didn't get much attention aside from Jews of Romania, to which the pogroms also started to seep. These Romanian Jews started to create local organizations for the immigration of Jews to Israel. In October 1881, the Russian authorities kept being incompetent in stopping the massacres, which became even more numerous. But this time, Alliance also announced that it cannot support more Jews immigrating to the United States. So far, 1,500 Jews left for New York. And that they won't find any jobs there, and that they will not provide more money for those leaving Russia. At this time, the articles in Jewish newspapers to live for Israel specifically became more numerous, and more Jews became interested. Moshe Leib Lilienblum, a young Jewish intellectual, published a popular article in his newspaper, the Rasvit, in October the 9th, in which he said Jews will keep being persecuted as long as they don't consist a majority of a certain land. The national zeal of the nations would never accept Jews, and even if they would adopt Christianity, they would still be ostracized. There is no future for the Jews in this modern world as long as they don't have a land of their own. Lilienblum gave 3 options. 1. To become eternally persecuted victims for all the sadists of the world, to try and assimilate with the non-Jews, a process that would take hundreds of years, in which many Jews would suffer until there is nothing left of the Jewish people. Or, the 3rd option, to cultivate a land in Israel under Ottoman rule and to emigrate to it in large numbers, making it in the future a self-sufficient land with a Jewish majority. As the massacres continued in early 1882, and especially in Balta, where hundreds of Jews were slaughtered together with a new form of pogrom, raids to specifically rape Jewish women, more and more voices called for immediate immigration to Israel. Some early idealistic immigrants who already came to Israel in 1881 also sent letters in which they preached for a much larger immigration to Israel. One of such people was the Jewish philologist and the one who recreated the Hebrew language as a modern spoken language, Eliezer Ben Yehuda. I would do a separate video on modern Hebrew and how it slowly ceased to be a scholarly religious language from the mid-19th century to the 1910s in the future. In an article he published in the Herald, he stressed that he, living in Jerusalem, has seen that Israel, in his time, 1882, 1881, has very few inhabitants, and those who live there have no national tendencies, living lazily under the Ottomans. Jewish immigration to Israel would cultivate this barren land, and the local population of the Arabs would be thrilled to have new factories, new jobs, food, and modern Jews that would elevate them as a people. This would also, of course, solve the Jewish problem in Eastern Europe. So let's sum things up. Since late 1881, there were groups in Eastern Europe that gathered to help Jews immigrate to Israel. While these groups were many, and they did gather tens of thousands of Jews, it was not until late 1882 that they managed to actually help thousands of Jews to get to Israel. These groups called themselves, or were called by the people, Hibat Tzion, the lovers of Zion. In the next video on Hibat Tzion, I will explain how these organizations functioned, what they managed to do, and how the life of the Jewish immigrants they sent to Israel to build self-sufficient agriculture, Jewish infrastructure in Israel looked like. Think about it.